Welcome to the Sleepy Historian. Tonight, we drift back once more to the age of the Vikings, to that time of long ships and cold seas, of saga and sword, when the North sent forth warriors whose deeds would echo across the centuries. We have walked before with Björn Ironside, who sailed to the Mediterranean. We have followed Ivar the Boneless, whose genius conquered kingdoms. But tonight, we turn to a different kind of legend, a story that challenges everything we think we know about the Viking Age, about women and warfare, about the line between history and myth. Her name was Lagertha, and she was, according to the sources that remember her, a Shieldmaiden, a woman who took up sword and spear, who fought alongside men in battle, who commanded warriors and fleets, who ruled as a jarl, and perhaps even as a queen. She was, if the tales can be believed, one of the most formidable warriors of her age, regardless of gender, a figure whose courage and skill in battle became legendary, even in a culture that celebrated martial prowess above almost all else. But here, at the very beginning of our journey, we must acknowledge something difficult, something that makes Lagertha's story both fascinating and frustrating. We know less about her than we do about Björn or Ivar. The sources are fewer, more fragmentary, more clearly legendary. We cannot trace her life with the same detail, cannot follow her through campaigns and conquests with the same certainty. The historical Lagertha, if she existed at all, is obscured behind layers of legend and interpretation, visible only in glimpses, like a figure seen through morning mist. Our primary source is a Danish historian named Saxo Grammaticus, who wrote in the late 12th century, some 300 years after the events he describes. His work, the Gesta Danorum, or History of the Danes, is part history and part mythology, a blend of fact and fiction that makes it both invaluable and unreliable. He tells us of Lagertha, describes her deeds, praises her courage. But he also tells us of supernatural beings and impossible events, of heroes who strain credibility and stories that seem more saga than chronicle. And so we must walk carefully, must acknowledge what we do not know, must be honest about the difference between what the sources claim and what history can verify. But we must also honor the legend, must tell the story as it has been told for centuries, must recognize that even if Lagertha, the historical person, is lost to us, Lagertha, the symbol, the idea, the representation of women's courage and capability. This is worth remembering, worth celebrating, worth passing down through the generations. For whether she was one woman or many, whether the tales are literal truth or poetic compression of multiple lives and deeds, whether she existed exactly as described or represents something larger and more complex, the story of Lagertha matters. It matters because it challenges assumptions, because it opens possibilities, because it reminds us that the past was more diverse, more complicated, more surprising than we often imagine. And so we begin, knowing what we do not know, acknowledging the gaps and uncertainties, but committed to telling the story that has been preserved, the legend that has endured. We begin with a young woman in Norway, in the cold lands of the north, in a time when the Viking Age was just beginning, when the raids on England and Francia were still in their early stages, when Ragnar Lothbrok was not yet the legendary king he would become, but merely an ambitious jarl seeking to make his mark on the world. According to Saxo, Lagertha's story begins with tragedy and violence, with an event that would set her on the path to becoming a warrior, a Shieldmaiden, a woman who would be remembered for 1,000 years. Norway had been invaded, or so the story goes, by a Swedish king seeking to expand his territory. In the chaos of this invasion, Norwegian noblewomen were captured, imprisoned, subjected to humiliation and abuse by the conquerors. This was the world into which Lagertha entered the historical record, or the legendary record, a world of violence and violation, of women treated as spoils of war, as property to be taken and used. It was, sadly, a common enough story in the Viking Age, in most ages of human history. Women in warfare were often victims, rarely warriors, almost never heroes of their own tales. But Lagertha, according to Saxo, refused to be a victim. When the opportunity came, when a young Danish Jarl named Ragnar arrived with his forces to liberate the Norwegian nobles and drive out the Swedish invaders, she did not wait to be rescued. She armed herself, took up weapons, joined the fighting. And not merely joined it, but excelled at it, fought with such skill and ferocity that she drew the attention of Ragnar himself, who watched this woman warrior and felt something stir in his heart, something beyond mere admiration for a fellow fighter. This is the beginning of the legend, this moment when a woman stepped out of the role assigned to her by society and culture, when she became something unexpected, something that challenged the normal order of things. Whether it happened exactly as Saxo describes, we cannot know. But the story itself, the very fact that such a tale was told and remembered, tells us something important about the Viking Age, about the spaces where women could claim power, about the ways that exceptional individuals could transcend the limitations of gender. The Vikings, for all their reputation for violence and patriarchy, actually had a more complex relationship with women's power than many medieval cultures. Women could own property, could divorce their husbands, could inherit and manage wealth, could exercise considerable authority within the domestic sphere and sometimes beyond it. And while female warriors were certainly not common, they were not unthinkable, were not so far outside the realm of possibility that a story about one would seem absurd. There are other hints scattered across the Viking Age of women who fought. Archaeological discoveries have found some graves initially identified as male warriors that proved, upon modern analysis, to contain female remains buried with weapons and warriors' equipment. The sagas, while dominated by male heroes, occasionally mention women who took up arms, who defended their homes, who sometimes accompanied raiding expeditions. Were these women common? Number? Were they accepted without question by their male peers? Almost certainly not. But they existed, in some form, in some numbers, enough that the culture could conceive of them, could tell stories about them, could preserve the memory of women, like Lagertha, who stepped outside the usual boundaries and proved themselves in the most masculine of arenas, the battlefield. And so, Lagertha, whether historical figure or legendary composite, represents a possibility, a glimpse of the diversity that existed within Viking culture, a reminder that the past, like the present, contained multitudes, that there was space for the exceptional, the unusual, the extraordinary. Saxo tells us that Ragnar was captivated by Lagertha, that he sought to win her hand in marriage. But Lagertha, having proven herself a warrior, would not be won easily, would not simply submit to a husband's authority because he desired her. She set tests, challenges, obstacles that Ragnar would have to overcome before she would agree to marry him. The specific tests vary in different retellings, embellished by later authors who found in Lagertha's story fertile ground for romantic elaboration. But the core idea remains consistent. Lagertha demanded that her suitor prove himself worthy, that he demonstrate not just desire, but respect, not just power, but partnership. She would not be conquered, would not be taken as a prize. She would choose, would consent, would enter marriage as an equal partner rather than as property. This too tells us something important, not necessarily about the historical Lagertha, but about the ideal she represented, the kind of woman Viking culture could, at least sometimes, admire and celebrate. She was strong, independent, demanding of respect, unwilling to compromise her dignity or her freedom lightly. And a man like Ragnar, who would become legendary for his own deeds, recognized these qualities as worthy of admiration, as making her more desirable rather than less. Ragnar overcame her tests, or so the story goes. He proved himself clever as well as strong, persistent as well as brave. He won her consent, and they married, and for a time they ruled together, partners in both war and peace, a Jarl and his warrior wife, united in ambition and in love. But this is only the beginning of Lagertha's story, the first chapter in a tale that would span decades, that would include battles and betrayals, triumphs and tragedies, love and loss. For Lagertha was not simply Ragnar's wife, wasn't defined solely by her relationship to him. She would prove to have her own ambitions, her own vision, her own destiny to fulfill. The sources are vague about the years of their marriage, about what they accomplished together, about how they ruled and fought and lived. We catch only glimpses, fragments of stories that may or may not be true. But we can imagine them. This warrior couple, this partnership of equals that was so unusual for the age, leading raids together, planning strategies, building the power base that would eventually make Ragnar one of the most famous Vikings who ever lived. And we can imagine Lagertha in these years, not just as a wife, but as a warrior, as a leader, as a woman who had proven herself in battle and who continued to prove herself, who commanded respect through deeds rather than merely through her connection to a powerful husband. She was, in the fullest sense, a Shieldmaiden, a woman who had claimed space in the masculine world of Viking warfare, and who held that space through skill and courage. But marriages, even the best of them, are subject to the pressures of time and circumstance, to the conflicts that arise when strong personalities share power and ambition. And the marriage of Ragnar and Lagertha, according to the sources, would not last forever, would eventually fracture under strains that neither could overcome, that would send them down separate paths, that would transform their partnership into something else, something more complex and more painful. But that part of the story must wait. For now, let us stay in this beginning, in the moment when a young woman became a warrior, when she caught the eye of a man who would be legend, when she set tests and was won, when she became not just Ragnar's wife, but Lagertha the Shieldmaiden, a name that would echo across the centuries, a symbol of courage and strength, a reminder that the Viking Age held possibilities we are only beginning to understand. The Saga of Lagertha is beginning. The legend is taking shape. And though we must walk carefully through sources that blend history and myth, though we must acknowledge what we cannot know, still the story calls to us, invites us to follow this remarkable woman through her life and her legend, to honor what she represents, even as we question what she was. Welcome to the tale of Lagertha, the Shieldmaiden who became a legend. May her courage inspire you as you drift into sleep. May her strength remind you of what is possible. May her story carry you gently through the night into dreams of ancient times and distant shores. And so we drift onward, back across the centuries, into the cold north, into the age of heroes and shield maidens, into the legend that will not die, the tale of the woman warrior who proved that courage knows no gender, that strength takes many forms, that a woman can stand beside men in battle and surpass them, that legends can be born from any life lived boldly, any heart brave enough to step beyond what is expected and claim what seems impossible. The story is beginning. The North awaits. And Lagertha, young and fierce and extraordinary, is ready to write her name across history, to become immortal through deeds that would be remembered long after empires fell and ages passed, that would inspire women and men alike to reach beyond their limitations, to claim their power, to become legends in their own right. The life of a Viking woman, even under the best circumstances, was not easy. The cold was relentless, the winters dark and long, survival itself a constant challenge. Women worked from dawn to dusk, managing households, raising children, weaving cloth, preparing food, tending animals, preserving the harvest that would sustain the family through the frozen months. It was exhausting labor, essential to survival, honored within the culture, but also relentless, unending, consuming. For most women, this was the entirety of life, the boundary of possibility. They might exercise considerable power within the domestic sphere, might manage significant resources, might even inherit property and wealth. But their authority was confined, their ambitions channeled into acceptable forms, their strength expressed through endurance rather than action. But Lagertha, if we are to believe the sources, chose a different path. She had tasted battle, had felt the rush of combat, had discovered something in herself that could not be satisfied by the normal roles available to women. She had proven she could fight, could stand in the shield wall, could face death without flinching. And having proven it once, she could not simply set aside sword and spear and return to loom and cook fire as if nothing had changed. This was her extraordinary choice, the decision that would define her legend. To be a shield maiden was not simply to fight once, in a moment of crisis, defending home and family when no other option existed. It was to make warfare a central part of one's identity, to train and prepare for battle, to seek out combat rather than merely enduring it when it came. It was to claim a space in the masculine world of Viking raiders and warriors, to demand respect as a fighter rather than as a wife or daughter or mother. How did she train? The sources do not tell us, leave us to imagine the hours of practice, the development of skills, the building of strength and endurance necessary to fight effectively with sword and spear and shield. But we can picture her in the training yard, working alongside men, or perhaps alone, perfecting techniques, building the muscle memory that would save her life in battle, preparing herself for the demands of combat. The weapons of a Viking warrior were simple but effective. The sword was the most prestigious, expensive, often passed down through families, given names and histories of their own. But more common was the spear, versatile weapon that could thrust or throw, that required less metal than a sword. That was the workhorse of Viking warfare. And every warrior carried a shield, round and wooden, painted in bright colors, reinforced with metal, used both for defense and as a weapon in its own right, its boss capable of stunning an opponent, its edge used to strike and push. Armor, if one could afford it, was a shirt of mail, iron rings linked together to form a flexible protection that could turn aside glancing blows without restricting movement. But mail was expensive, required skilled craftsmen to produce, was beyond the means of most warriors. More common was simple leather armor, thick and hardened, offering some protection while allowing the mobility that Viking tactics required. And there was the psychological preparation, perhaps harder than the physical. To fight effectively, one had to overcome the natural human aversion to violence, had to train oneself to strike without hesitation, to endure pain without breaking, to function in the chaos and terror of battle. This was true for all warriors, male or female. But for Lagertha, there may have been an additional burden, the knowledge that any failure, any moment of weakness would be attributed not to her as an individual but to her gender, would be used as evidence that women had no place in warfare. She must have felt this pressure, this need to be not just good, but exceptional, to prove herself again and again, to earn respect that men received simply by virtue of being men. It was unfair, exhausting, the kind of burden that would have broken many people. But Lagertha, according to the legend, did not break. She rose to the challenge, exceeded it, became known not as a woman who fought, but as a warrior who happened to be a woman, someone whose skill commanded respect regardless of gender. Saxo tells us that she fought alongside Ragnar in his campaigns, that she commanded her own troops, that she was recognized as a Jarl in her own right, with warriors oath-bound to her service. This was an extraordinary position for any Viking, male or female, but especially remarkable for a woman. To command warriors meant to inspire loyalty, to demonstrate leadership, to prove oneself worthy of trust in the most extreme circumstances. How did she accomplish this? Partly through skill, certainly. Warriors respect competence, value leaders who can help them survive and win. But also through something else, some quality of presence, of authority, of will that made men willing to follow her, to accept her commands, to stand beside her in the shield wall. The shield wall, the fundamental tactic of Viking warfare, required absolute trust between warriors. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, protecting not just themselves but their neighbors, creating a mobile fortress that could advance or defend, that won through collective strength rather than individual heroism. To fight in the shield wall was to put your life in your companions' hands, to trust that they would hold, that they would not break and leave you exposed to enemy weapons. For men to accept Lagertha into the shield wall, to trust her to hold her position, to depend on her in matters of life and death, she must have proven herself utterly reliable, must have demonstrated again and again that she would not fail, would not break, would stand firm no matter what came against them. This was the ultimate test of a Viking warrior, and Lagertha passed it, earned the trust of men who fought beside her, the respect of those who followed her. But there was also resistance, skepticism, mockery from those who believed women had no place in warfare. The sources hint at this, though they do not dwell on it, suggest that Lagertha faced criticism, that not everyone accepted her claim to warrior status. Some saw her as an aberration, others as a threat to the proper order of things. Still others simply refused to believe that a woman could truly match men in combat. Lagertha's response, if we are to judge by the legend, wasn't to argue or justify herself, but simply to fight, to demonstrate through action what words could not prove, to let her deeds speak for themselves. This was the Viking way, after all, the culture that valued actions over words, that judged people by what they did rather than what they claimed. And by this standard, Lagertha had nothing to prove, had already demonstrated her worth through the most definitive test possible: survival in battle. Her marriage to Ragnar during these years was both partnership and competition. Two strong personalities, two warriors, two leaders, sharing power and ambition, supporting each other, but also potentially conflicting, each with their own vision of what should be done, how victories should be won, what the future should hold. The sources suggest they had children together, though details are vague and inconsistent. If so, then Lagertha faced yet another challenge that male warriors didn't: the physical demands of pregnancy and childbirth, the recovery period after, the biological realities that made continuous warfare difficult or impossible during these times. How she managed this, how she balanced the demands of motherhood with the demands of being a warrior, we are not told. Perhaps she had periods of withdrawal from active fighting, times when she focused on her children and let others lead the raids. Perhaps she had nurses and helpers who took on the daily care of children while she continued to campaign. Perhaps, as some sources hint, her children were raised in the warrior tradition from earliest youth, prepared to follow in their mother's footsteps, to become warriors themselves. Whatever the details, and we must acknowledge they are lost to us, Lagertha somehow managed to maintain her position as both warrior and woman, to fulfill roles that Viking society generally kept separate, to be exceptional in ways that required constant effort, constant proof, constant vigilance against those who would dismiss or diminish her. The years of her marriage to Ragnar, we can imagine, were years of building power, of accumulating wealth and reputation, of establishing the foundations of what would become her own independent realm. For the sources tell us, and this is one of the clearest parts of her legend, that Lagertha would eventually rule in her own right, not as consort, but as Jarl, commanding her own forces, holding her own lands, independent of any husband. But that independence would come at a cost, would require a break with Ragnar, would mark the end of their partnership and the beginning of a new phase in both their lives. The marriage that had begun with tests and courtship, that had been a union of equals and warriors, would eventually fracture, would end not in death, but in divorce, would leave both of them to pursue their own destinies apart. The reasons for the divorce are obscured by time and by the narrative purposes of Saxo, who had his own agenda in telling these stories. He suggests that Ragnar was unfaithful, that he set aside Lagertha to marry another woman, Thora, drawn by beauty or political advantage, or simply the restlessness that seems to have characterized Ragnar throughout his life. Other sources suggest other reasons, or no clear reason at all, simply the recognition that what had once worked no longer did, that two such strong personalities could not indefinitely share power and decision-making. That separation was necessary if either was to fully realize their potential. Whatever the truth, the marriage ended. Ragnar went south, seeking new conquests, new adventures, eventually marrying Aslaug and fathering the sons who would become legends in their own right. And Lagertha returned north to Norway, where she would carve out her own domain, where she would prove that she needed no husband to be powerful, that she could rule and fight and command in her own name. This was the true test of her legend, the proof that she was more than just Ragnar's warrior wife. For many women of the Viking age who wielded power did so through their relationships to powerful men, as daughters or wives or widows of jarls and kings. But Lagertha claimed power in her own right, built it through her own efforts, maintained it through her own skills. She returned to Norway and carved out a jarldom, rallying warriors to her cause, establishing control over territory, defending it against rivals who thought a woman jarl would be easy prey. And she proved them wrong, decisively and repeatedly, until her position was secure, until her authority was recognized, until her name was spoken with respect and fear in equal measure. How long this took, what battles were fought, what alliances were made and broken, the sources do not tell us in detail. But we know the outcome. Lagertha established herself as one of the powerful Jarls of Norway, a force to be reckoned with, a leader whose opinion mattered in the councils of the North. She had achieved what seemed impossible, had transcended every limitation that society placed on women, had become not just a warrior, but a ruler, not just a Shieldmaiden, but a Jarl. And she had done it through skill and courage, through refusing to accept what others said was impossible, through proving again and again that she was exceptional. The legend was growing, spreading beyond the immediate region where she ruled, carried by travelers and traders, by skalds who recognized good material when they heard it. The story of Lagertha the Shieldmaiden, the woman who fought like a man, who ruled in her own right, who had married Ragnar Lothbrok himself, and then left him to pursue her own destiny. This was the kind of tale that Vikings loved, that captured something essential about their values, even as it challenged their assumptions. But the story was far from over, for Lagertha would hear news from the south, would learn that Ragnar faced troubles, that the man she had once loved was in danger, and she would have to make a choice to decide whether the past mattered, whether the bonds that had once connected them still held any claim on her heart and her loyalty. That choice, and what came after, would define the final act of her saga, would show whether Lagertha was capable of forgiveness as well as fierceness, whether love could survive divorce, whether the Shieldmaiden's heart was as exceptional as her sword arm. But that moment still lay ahead, separated from this present by years of ruling, of establishing her independence, of proving that she could stand alone. The warrior's path had brought her to this point, to leadership and power, to a place where she answered to no one, where her voice commanded and was obeyed. She had become everything she had set out to become, had achieved what society said was impossible for a woman, had written her name in the annals of history through sheer force of will and skill. And yet, as she would soon discover, the greatest tests still lay ahead, challenges not of combat, but of loyalty, not of strength, but of choice. The legend of Lagertha was approaching its climax, the moment that would define her forever, that would show what kind of woman she truly was beneath the armor and the reputation. And in that moment, she would prove that being a warrior was not just about skill with weapons, but about courage of a different kind. The courage to act on principle, even when it cost her dearly. The courage to be true to herself and her values, no matter what others thought or said. But for now, let us leave her in her power, ruling her jarldom, respected and feared, independent and strong. The Shieldmaiden who had become a jarl, the woman who had proven that courage and skill knew no gender, that legends could be made by anyone brave enough to claim them. Years passed in the cold lands of Norway, where Lagertha ruled her jarldom with the same skill and determination she had shown in battle. The seasons turned, winter following summer following winter, the rhythm of life in the north continuing as it always had. Ships came and went from her harbours, bringing trade goods and news from across the Viking world. Warriors trained in her service swore oaths to her, looked to her for leadership and protection. She had built something lasting, something that would have satisfied most people, that would have been achievement enough for any normal jarl. But Lagertha was not normal, had never been normal, and perhaps there was a restlessness in her still, a memory of the days when she had fought beside Ragnar, when every season brought new adventures, new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself. News came from the south, carried by traders and travelers, the kind of news that spread quickly through the interconnected world of the Vikings. Ragnar Lothbrok, now married to Aslaug, ruling over lands in Denmark and Sweden, faced a crisis. A civil war had erupted, rivals challenging his authority, warriors who had once followed him, now raised in rebellion. The details varied depending on who told the story, but the core facts were consistent enough. Ragnar was in trouble, was fighting for his survival, was outnumbered by enemies who sensed weakness, who thought that perhaps the great king's time had passed, that he could be overthrown and replaced. Lagertha heard this news, and we can only imagine what she felt. Ragnar was her former husband, yes, But more than that, he had been her partner, her equal, the man who had recognized her worth when others saw only strangeness. Their marriage had ended. They had gone their separate ways. But did that erase what had been? Did divorce mean that she owed him nothing, that his fate was not her concern? She had built her independence on separation from him, had proven that she could rule without him, that her power was her own and not merely borrowed from his reputation. To go to his aid now might seem like a retreat, an admission that she still defined herself through relationship to him, that she had not truly broken free. But there was another way to see it, another interpretation that was perhaps more true to who Lagertha was. To help Ragnar now would not be to subordinate herself to him, but to choose freely from a position of strength, to honor what had been between them, to demonstrate that independence did not require hardness of heart, that one could be strong and still capable of loyalty, fierce and still capable of gratitude. The sources tell us that Lagertha made her decision quickly, that she did not agonize or hesitate, but acted with the decisiveness that had always characterized her. She would go to Ragnar's aid. She would gather her warriors, her ships, would sail south to Denmark, would throw her forces into the battle on Ragnar's side. It was a risk, certainly. She was leaving her own lands potentially vulnerable, was taking her best warriors away from the protection of her jarldom. She was choosing to involve herself in someone else's war, to spend blood and treasure for a cause that was not strictly her own. And she was doing it for a man who had divorced her, who had chosen another woman over her, who had no claim on her loyalty except the claim of memory and perhaps affection. But Lagertha had never chosen the safe path, had never let fear or calculation override what her heart and her sense of honor demanded. And so she prepared her expedition, called in her warriors, readied her ships. The news spread through her domain. Lagertha was going to war, was sailing south, was going to the aid of Ragnar Lothbrok. We can imagine the reactions, the mixture of excitement and concern, the questions about why she would risk so much for a former husband. But if Lagertha explained her reasoning, if she justified her decision to her warriors and advisers, those explanations are lost to us. The sources simply tell us that she went, that she made the choice and acted on it, as she had always done. The fleet that sailed south from Norway was substantial, 120 ships according to Saxo, though numbers in medieval sources are always suspect, often inflated for dramatic effect. But whether it was exactly that many or fewer, it was clearly a significant force, a substantial portion of Lagertha's military strength, enough to potentially turn the tide of Ragnar's civil war. The voyage south was uneventful, or at least the sources record no disasters, no storms or battles at sea. The ships followed the familiar routes along the Norwegian and Danish coasts, passing settlements and harbors, cutting through waters that had carried Viking ships for generations. And Lagertha stood at the prow of her flagship, watching the coastline slide past, feeling the familiar motion of the deck beneath her feet, the salt spray in her face, the wind in her hair. She was in her element, doing what she had always done best, leading warriors, commanding a fleet, going into battle. The years of ruling from a hall, of managing estates and judging disputes, had been necessary, had built her power and independence. But this was what she was made for, what her soul sang for. The voyage, the coming battle, the chance to prove herself once more in the most definitive way possible. They reached Denmark and learned the disposition of forces, the state of Ragnar's struggle. It was as bad as the reports had suggested, perhaps worse. Ragnar was surrounded, outnumbered, his forces depleted by months of fighting, his position precarious. Without help, he would likely fall, would be killed or driven into exile, his kingdom divided among the victors. But now help had arrived, unexpected and overwhelming. Lagertha's fleet, her warriors, her proven leadership, all thrown onto Ragnar's side of the scales, potentially changing everything. The rebels, who had thought victory was within their grasp, now faced an enemy they had not anticipated, a force led by someone whose reputation preceded her. For Lagertha was known, even here in Denmark, even among men who had never met her. The stories of the Shieldmaiden who had married Ragnar, who had fought in battles, who had become a Jarl in her own right. These tales had spread across the Viking world. And now the legend had arrived in person, with ships and warriors, ready to demonstrate that the stories were not exaggerations, but perhaps understatements. The final battle of Ragnar's civil war, according to Saxo, was decided by Lagertha's intervention. He describes her leading her warriors in a flanking maneuver, striking at the rebels from an unexpected direction, breaking their formation at a crucial moment. He tells us that her presence inspired Ragnar's forces, gave them new heart, reminded them that they fought for a king who commanded such loyalty that even his former wife would come to his aid. The rebels, caught between Ragnar's forces and Lagertha's, surrounded and outnumbered by the very strategy they had hoped to employ against Ragnar, broke and fled. The battle became a rout. The civil war ended in a single day. Ragnar's position secure once more, his kingdom preserved. And all of this, Saxo makes clear, was due to Lagertha's intervention, to her decision to risk everything, to help a man who was no longer her husband, to honor what had been between them, even though the formal bonds were broken. It was an act of extraordinary generosity, or perhaps of lingering love, or perhaps simply of the warrior's code that said you stood by those who had once stood by you. That loyalty transcended the legal and social bonds that might be made or broken. After the battle, according to the sources, there was a reunion between Ragnar and Lagertha, a meeting that must have been charged with emotion, with memory, with all the complexity of their shared past. Ragnar, we are told, was grateful, was moved by Lagertha's aid, perhaps even regretted his decision to divorce her, to set her aside for another woman. He asked her, or so some versions suggest, to remain, to take up once more the position at his side, to be his wife again, to rule alongside him as they once had. It was an offer that would have tempted many, that represented security and prestige, that would have been seen by most as a triumph, a validation that Lagertha was worthy of a king's love. But Lagertha refused. She had built her own power, had established her own independence, had proven that she could rule in her own right. To give that up, to subordinate herself once more to Ragnar's authority, to become again merely the wife of a king rather than a Jarl in her own name. This was not something she could accept, no matter what she might still feel for him. Her refusal, according to the sources, was firm, but not cruel, respectful, but absolute. She had come to his aid because honor demanded it, because of what had been between them, because she chose to help. But that choice didn't mean she was willing to give up her independence, to return to a relationship that had already failed once, to sacrifice what she had built for the sake of what had been. And Ragnar, to his credit, accepted her decision. He thanked her for her aid, loaded her ships with gifts and treasure, acknowledged her nobility of character, and let her go. They parted as friends, as former loves who still cared for each other, but understood that their paths had diverged, that they were better apart than together. This moment, this refusal, this choice to maintain her independence even when offered a return to Ragnar's side, this perhaps more than anything else defines what made Lagertha extraordinary. She had the strength to fight, yes. She had the courage to face death in battle. But she also had the strength to refuse what many would have accepted, to choose freedom over security, to value her independence more than even the love of a legendary king. And so she sailed north again, back to Norway, back to her jarldom, her ships heavier with treasure, her reputation enhanced by her actions, her position stronger than ever. She had proven her loyalty, had demonstrated her generosity, had shown that she was capable of rising above personal grievance to do what honor required. And she had also proven her resolve, her refusal to compromise her independence, her determination to remain her own person, beholden to no one. The legend of Lagertha was complete, or nearly so. She had been a warrior, a wife, a jarl. She had fought alongside men and commanded them. She had loved and been loved by a legendary king, had married him and divorced him, and saved him. She had built power and wielded it wisely. She had proven that women could be warriors, rulers, independent actors who shaped history rather than merely enduring it. What remained of her life, what years still stretched before her, the sources do not tell us in detail. Saxo's account of Lagertha effectively ends with her return from Denmark, with this final demonstration of her character and strength. We are left to imagine the rest, the years of continued rule, the aging of a warrior, the eventual death that comes to all, regardless of how legendary their life. But perhaps this is fitting, that the legend ends at its height, that we do not have to watch Lagertha grow old and weak, that we can preserve the image of her in her prime, victorious and independent, having proven everything she set out to prove, having achieved everything that seemed impossible. She had been a Shieldmaiden, the woman warrior of legend and perhaps of history. She had lived a life that challenged every assumption about what women could be and do. She had carved her name across the sagas, had ensured that she would be remembered for as long as humans told stories of the Viking Age. And though we may never know with certainty whether she was one woman or many, whether the tales are literally true or poetically true, whether she existed exactly as described or represents something larger and more symbolic, still her legend matters, still her story inspires, Still, the name Lagertha echoes across the centuries as a reminder of possibility, of courage, of the refusal to be limited by others' expectations. The Shieldmaiden's saga is approaching its end. But the legacy, the inspiration, the challenge to our assumptions about the past and about the capabilities of women, these continue, these endure, these ensure that Lagertha, whether historical figure or legendary ideal, will never be forgotten. Let us imagine, for we must imagine, where the sources fall silent, what Lagertha's life was like in the years after her return from Denmark, in a time when she ruled her jarldom in peace, or as much peace as the Viking Age ever allowed. For this is a part of her story that is rarely told, that seems less dramatic than battles and marriages, but that may reveal as much about her character as any fight. She returned to Norway with treasure and enhanced reputation, with the gratitude of Ragnar and the respect of warriors across the north. But she returned also to the daily realities of rule, to the endless work of maintaining authority, managing resources, resolving disputes, defending borders. This was the unglamorous side of power, the part that sagas rarely emphasized, but that consumed most of a ruler's time and energy. A Jarl's Hall in 9th century Norway was both fortress and community centre, both home and seat of government. It would have been substantial, built of wood and thatch, with a great central room where warriors gathered, where feasts were held, where justice was dispensed. There would have been sleeping quarters, storerooms, workshops, all the infrastructure needed to support not just Lagertha herself, but the household that depended on her, that looked to her for protection and prosperity. Running such an establishment required skills different from those needed in battle. It required economic acumen, the ability to manage estates and trade goods, to ensure that harvests were sufficient and that wealth was preserved and increased. It required diplomatic skill, the ability to manage relationships with other jarls and kings, to know when to make alliances and when to stand alone. It required judicial wisdom, the ability to settle disputes fairly, to maintain law and order, to balance justice with mercy. These were not skills typically associated with warriors, but they were essential to maintaining power, to transforming military victory into lasting authority. And Lagertha, who had proven herself exceptional in warfare, now had to prove herself equally capable in these other domains. The sources suggest she succeeded, that her jarldom prospered, that she was known as a fair ruler whose judgment could be trusted. But they give us few details, leave us to imagine how she navigated the complexities of Viking Age politics, how she balanced the various factions and interests within her domain, how she maintained authority in a world where power was always being tested, where any sign of weakness could invite challenge. There would have been other jarls, neighboring rulers with their own ambitions, some of whom might have thought that a woman jarl would be easier to intimidate or conquer. Lagertha would have had to deal with these challenges, both through diplomacy and, when necessary, through the threat or use of force. Her reputation as a warrior would have helped, would have made potential enemies think twice. But reputation alone is never enough. She would have had to back it up, to demonstrate repeatedly that attacking her lands was not worth the cost. There would have been internal challenges, too. Ambitious warriors within her own following, who might have wondered whether they should be Jarl instead. Whether Lagertha's gender made her somehow less legitimate, less worthy of command. These tensions, common in any warrior society, would have been heightened by the unusual nature of her rule. She would have had to manage them carefully, rewarding loyalty, punishing betrayal, maintaining the delicate balance that kept her warriors committed to her service. And there would have been the simple economic realities of maintaining a jarldom in a harsh land. Crops could fail, ships could be lost to storms, trade goods might not fetch the expected prices. A ruler had to plan for these contingencies, had to maintain reserves, had to ensure that her people could survive the bad years as well as prosper in the good ones. Lagertha navigated all of this, or so we must assume from the fact that her rule continued, that she maintained her position until the end of her life. She was not simply a warrior who happened to rule, but a ruler who happened to also be a warrior. Someone who understood that power had many dimensions, that lasting authority required more than just martial prowess. But there was also, we can imagine, a personal cost to this life, a loneliness that came from being unique, from having no peers, no one else who truly understood what it meant to be what she was. Other jarls could bond with each other over shared experiences, could form friendships based on mutual understanding. But who could Lagertha bond with? Who else had walked her path, had faced her challenges, had been a woman warrior in a man's world? She may have had friendships, certainly, companions and advisers who were close to her. But there would always have been a distance, a gap created by her unique position, by the fact that she wasn't just another jarl, but something unprecedented, something that existed outside the normal categories by which Vikings understood the world. Did she regret her choices? Did she ever wonder what her life would have been like if she had accepted the normal role assigned to women? If she had married Ragnar and stayed married? If she had been content to be a wife and mother and nothing more? We cannot know. The sources do not tell us of any such regrets, suggest instead that she was satisfied with her choices, proud of what she had achieved. But in the quiet moments, in the long winter nights when the hall was empty and the fires burned low, surely she must have wondered. Surely there must have been times when the burden of being exceptional felt too heavy, when she longed for the simpler life she had rejected, when the loneliness of her unique position weighed on her spirit. Yet she persisted. She ruled, she led, she maintained her independence and her authority. And in doing so, she created a space of possibility, showed that what she had done could be done, that women need not accept the limitations society placed on them, that courage and skill could open doors that seemed permanently closed. Her hall, we can imagine, became a place where women who did not fit the normal mold might find acceptance, where Shieldmaidens or would-be Shieldmaidens might come to train, to learn, to see living proof that their ambitions were not impossible. Lagertha, having achieved what she had achieved, would have understood better than anyone the importance of such role models, the difference it made to see someone who had walked the path you hoped to walk. How many young women came to her hall over the years, seeking to become warriors, seeking to learn from the most famous Shieldmaiden in the north. The sources do not tell us, but we can imagine them. These girls and young women who looked at the normal life offered to them and wanted something more, who saw in Lagertha proof that something more was possible. Some would have succeeded, would have proven themselves capable, would have become warriors in their own right, carrying forward the legacy Lagertha had created. Others would have failed, would have discovered that the warrior's path was not for them, that the romantic ideal of the Shieldmaiden did not match the harsh reality of battle. But all of them would have been changed by the experience, by the knowledge that they had tried, that they had not simply accepted the role assigned to them, but had tested themselves against something harder. This legacy, the inspiration Lagertha provided to women who came after her, may be as important as any battle she fought, any kingdom she helped save. For battles end, kingdoms fall, but ideas endure. Possibilities once demonstrated cannot be erased. Lagertha showed that women could be warriors, and that showing changed what was thinkable, expanded the realm of possibility for all women who came after. The years passed, as years always do, carrying Lagertha from her prime toward old age, from the height of her physical powers toward the inevitable decline that comes to all warriors, all leaders, all mortals, regardless of their achievements. Her hair would have grayed, her body would have accumulated the aches and pains of old wounds, of a lifetime of hard use. The sword would have grown heavier in her hand, the shield more burdensome on her arm. This is the part of the warrior's story that sagas rarely tell, the undramatic decline, the slow fade of abilities that once seemed boundless. But it is as real and as important as any battle, as much a part of the human story as victory or defeat. And for Lagertha, who had built her entire identity on being a warrior, on physical prowess and martial skill, this decline must have been particularly difficult, a slow grief for the self she had been, for the capabilities she no longer possessed. But she was still Jarl, still ruler of her domain, still the woman whose name was spoken with respect across the north. Age might have taken her strength, but it had given her something in return. Experience, wisdom, the perspective that comes from having lived through so much, from having seen so many summers and winters, from understanding how the patterns repeated, how the young made the same mistakes she had made, how history turned in great, slow cycles. And she was still Lagertha, still the Shieldmaiden, still the legend. That did not change with age, did not fade with physical decline. If anything, it grew stronger, as the tales were told and retold, as each telling added something new, as the woman became the myth, as history transformed into saga. But there was one final chapter to be written, one last event that would complete her story, that would show what kind of woman she was at the end as she had been at the beginning. And it would be darker than what came before, more troubling, more complex, revealing that even legends are human, that even heroes can make choices that disturb and confuse, that the line between strength and ruthlessness is thinner than we might like to believe. For the end of Lagertha's story, according to Saxo, involves betrayal and murder, involves the killing of a husband, involves an act that challenges our understanding of who she was and what she represented. And we must confront this, must acknowledge that the legend has dark corners, that the Shieldmaiden was not simply a hero, but something more complicated, more human, more troubling. But that final act must wait for its own telling, must be approached carefully, must be understood in context rather than judged hastily. For now, let us leave Lagertha in her hall, ruling her jarldom, aging but still formidable, still respected, still the woman who had proven that courage and determination could overcome any obstacle, that women could be warriors, rulers, legends. The saga is approaching its end, the final act is coming. But for now, there is peace, or as much peace as the Viking age ever allowed. There is the satisfaction of a life well lived, of challenges met and overcome, of a legacy created that would endure long after the person was gone. Lagertha sits in her hall, surrounded by her warriors and advisors, judging disputes and planning for the future, managing the daily realities of power. And she remembers, surely, the battles she fought, the adventures she had, the man she loved and left, the choices she made that brought her to this place. She remembers being young and fierce and certain, remembers the first time she held a sword, the first time she stood in the shield wall, the first time she realized she could be more than what others expected. And she knows, with the certainty that comes from age and experience, that she was right to choose as she did, that the life she lived was worth living, that being exceptional was worth the cost, that the legend she created would matter long after she was gone. The fire burns low, the night grows deep, and Lagertha, the Shieldmaiden, the Jarl, the legend, rests in her hall, prepared for whatever final test awaits, ready to complete her saga, to write the last chapter in a story that has already earned her immortality. There comes a moment in many legends where the hero reveals an unexpected darkness, where the figure we have admired shows us something troubling, something that complicates our understanding, that forces us to confront the gap between legend and humanity. For Lagertha, that moment comes at the end of her story, in an act that Saxo records without fully explaining, that has troubled readers and scholars for centuries. According to Saxo, Lagertha married again in her later years. The man's name is given variously in different sources, but the details of his identity matter less than what followed. This was not a love match like her marriage to Ragnar had been. It was, we must assume, a political arrangement, an alliance that served her interests as a ruler, that strengthened her position or expanded her influence. The marriage, by all accounts, was not happy. Perhaps there was resentment on the husband's part, bitterness at being married to a woman more famous and more powerful than himself. Perhaps there were conflicts over authority, over who truly ruled, over whether Lagertha's power was her own or whether marriage transferred it to her husband. Perhaps there were simply the ordinary tensions of any marriage, magnified by extraordinary circumstances, by the clash of strong personalities, by expectations that could not be met. And then, according to Saxo, Lagertha killed him. She did not do it in battle, did not face him openly with sword in hand. She did it secretly, treacherously, using guile rather than strength. She concealed a weapon, waited for her moment, struck when he was defenseless. It was murder, pure and simple. Not an honorable death in combat, not a legal execution for some crime, but betrayal and assassination, the kind of act that Vikings, for all their violence, generally condemned. A warrior's death in battle was glorious, but death by treachery, death at the hands of one's own wife, this was shameful, dishonorable, the kind of death that stained both killer and victim. Why did she do it? Saxo doesn't give us clear motivation, leaves us to speculate, to try to understand what could have driven the legendary Shieldmaiden to such an act. Was it self-defense, a response to some threat he posed to her life or power? Was it ambition, a decision that she was better off ruling alone than sharing authority? Was it revenge for some wrong he had done her, some betrayal or abuse that Saxo does not record? Or was it simply pragmatism, the cold calculation of a ruler who had learned that power required ruthlessness, that sentiment and mercy were luxuries she could not afford? Had the years of ruling, of doing what was necessary to maintain authority, of making hard choices again and again, had all this hardened her, made her capable of acts she once would have rejected? We cannot know. The sources do not tell us, leave us with only the bare fact of the murder and the troubling questions it raises. And we must confront this, must acknowledge that the legend of Lagertha is not a simple tale of heroism and triumph, that the Shieldmaiden was capable of darkness as well as glory, that the same strength and determination that made her extraordinary could also lead her to terrible acts. This is uncomfortable, challenges our desire for heroes who are purely heroic, for legends who embody only virtues and no vices. We want Lagertha to be the warrior woman who proved women's capability, the strong female figure who transcended limitations and achieved greatness. We do not want her to be a murderer, do not want to acknowledge that the same qualities that made her formidable could also make her dangerous. But legends, when we examine them closely, are always more complex than we initially imagine. The heroes of saga and history are humans, capable of both great good and great evil, often within the same life, sometimes intertwined in ways that cannot be separated. Lagertha's murder of her husband is part of her story, cannot be erased or ignored, must be acknowledged and grappled with if we are to truly understand who she was. Perhaps we can understand it, at least partially, by considering the context of her life. She had fought for everything she achieved, had faced constant challenges to her authority, had lived always with the knowledge that any sign of weakness could be exploited, that her unusual position made her vulnerable in ways that male jarls were not. Perhaps she had learned, over decades of rule, that mercy was dangerous, that allowing threats to persist was foolish, that the only way to maintain power was to eliminate challenges decisively and permanently. This does not excuse the murder, does not make it right, but it may explain it, may help us understand how a woman who had once been noble enough to save her former husband could also become ruthless enough to murder her current one. Power corrupts, the saying goes, and while that may be oversimplified, there is truth in it. The longer one holds power, the more one sees it as essential, the more willing one becomes to do terrible things to preserve it. Or perhaps the explanation is simpler, more personal. Perhaps the marriage was genuinely abusive. Perhaps the husband posed a real threat to Lagertha's life or safety. Perhaps she acted in self-defense or preemptive defense, striking before he could strike her. Viking-age marriages could be violent. Wives were sometimes in genuine danger from their husbands, and a woman with Lagertha's skills and resources might well have chosen to eliminate such a threat, rather than endure it or flee from it. The sources do not give us enough information to judge with certainty. And perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps the ambiguity is part of the legend, part of what makes Lagertha's story enduring and complex. She is not a simple figure, not easily categorized, not reducible to hero or villain, but something more nuanced, more human. After the murder, Saxo tells us, Lagertha continued to rule, faced no apparent consequences for what she had done, maintained her authority until the end of her life. Perhaps no one dared challenge her. Perhaps her warriors remained loyal. Perhaps the murder was seen as justified, or at least understandable, in ways that Saxo, writing centuries later as a Christian, could not or would not acknowledge. Or perhaps there were consequences we do not know about, costs she paid that the sources do not record, burdens she carried that remained invisible to chroniclers interested only in the dramatic outlines of the story. Perhaps the murder haunted her, troubled her sleep, made her final years less peaceful than they might otherwise have been. Perhaps she wrestled with what she had done, questioned whether it was necessary, wondered if there had been another way. We cannot know. She left no diary, no confession, no explanation of her inner thoughts and feelings. We have only the external events, the bare facts that Saxo recorded, and we must construct meaning from these fragments, knowing that our understanding is necessarily incomplete, necessarily shaped by our own assumptions and values. What we can say is that Lagertha's story, including this dark ending, reminds us that real people are complex, that heroism and villainy are not always clearly separated, that the same person can embody both admirable and terrible qualities, that legends, when we examine them closely, reveal the full range of human possibility, both light and shadow. And perhaps this is valuable. Perhaps this complexity is what makes legends meaningful, what allows them to speak to us across centuries, what ensures that they remain relevant rather than becoming mere curiosities, interesting but disconnected from our own experience. For we too are complex, are capable of both good and evil, both strength and weakness, both nobility and betrayal. And in Lagertha's story, in all its complexity and ambiguity, we can see ourselves, can recognize the eternal human struggle between our better and worse natures, between what we aspire to be and what we sometimes become. The Shieldmaiden who fought alongside men, who married a legend and then left him to forge her own path, who ruled a jarldom with wisdom and strength, who saved her former husband when honor demanded it. This same Shieldmaiden murdered her current husband, betrayed the bonds of marriage, acted with a ruthlessness that violated the warrior's code she had lived by. Both of these are true. Both are part of her legend. And we must hold both in mind if we are to truly understand who Lagertha was, what her story means, why it has endured for more than 1,000 years. The end of her life after the murder is obscured by silence. Saxo does not tell us how she died, when it happened, what her final words or actions were. She simply fades from his chronicle, having served his narrative purpose, having illustrated whatever lessons he meant to teach through her story. Perhaps this is appropriate, this fading into silence. Perhaps it is fitting that the legend does not give us a neat conclusion, a tidy ending that wraps up all questions and provides closure. Instead, we are left with ambiguity, with uncertainty, with questions that cannot be answered and tensions that cannot be resolved. Lagertha lived. She fought, she loved, she ruled. She achieved extraordinary things and committed terrible acts. She proved that women could be warriors and showed that warriors, regardless of gender, are capable of both heroism and villainy. She created a legend that has endured for more than a millennium and left us with a story that challenges and complicates our understanding of the Viking Age, of women's history, of the relationship between strength and morality. This is her legacy, complex and troubling and inspiring all at once. And perhaps that complexity is what makes her enduring, what ensures that each generation finds something new in her story, some reflection of their own concerns and values, some challenge to their assumptions about what is possible and what is right. The Saga of Lagertha is ending, but the legend will continue, will be retold and reimagined, will inspire and trouble in equal measure, will ensure that the name Lagertha echoes across the centuries as a reminder that history is complex, that legends are human, that the past contains multitudes we are only beginning to understand. Long after Lagertha's death, long after her hall had fallen to ruin and her jarldom had been absorbed into other political entities, long after the last person who had known her personally was gone, the legend endured. It endured in ways both predictable and surprising, was shaped and reshaped by each generation that told her story, was made to serve purposes she never intended, was transformed from history into myth and from myth into symbol. Saxo Grammaticus, writing his History of the Danes in the late 12th century, preserved the most detailed account we have of Lagertha's life. But Saxo was not simply recording facts. He was a Christian scholar writing about pagan times, a man with his own agenda, his own lessons to teach. His Lagertha is filtered through his values and assumptions, shaped to fit his narrative purposes, made to illustrate points about courage and treachery, about pagan virtue and pagan vice. And yet, despite this filtering, despite the centuries that separated Saxo from his subject, despite all the ways his account is problematic and unreliable, still Lagertha emerges from his chronicle as a vivid, compelling figure. Still we can see through his words someone exceptional, someone who defied categorization, someone whose story demanded to be told even if the telling was imperfect and incomplete. After Saxo, Lagertha appeared sporadically in various sources, usually brief mentions, references to the famous Shieldmaiden, citations of Saxo's account without adding new information. The legend was preserved, but not expanded, maintained as part of the corpus of Viking Age stories, but not given the same prominence as Ragnar or his sons, not developed into the kind of full-fledged saga that other figures received. This may have been because she was a woman, because medieval chroniclers and saga writers, products of patriarchal societies, were more interested in male heroes than female ones. Or it may have been because the sources about her were so limited, because unlike Ragnar and his sons, whose deeds were recorded in multiple places, Lagertha appeared primarily in Saxo, giving later writers little to work with. But the legend survived, passed down through the centuries, kept alive by scholars and storytellers who recognized its value even if they did not fully develop it. Lagertha remained part of the Viking Age canon, a figure everyone interested in the period had at least heard of, even if the details of her story were vague. And then, in more recent times, Lagertha found new life, new prominence, new audiences who embraced her story with an enthusiasm that earlier generations had not shown. This revival began in the 19th century, during the Romantic period, when Europeans were rediscovering their medieval past, were celebrating national histories and folk traditions, were looking for heroes and legends that could embody national character. The Vikings, who had been vilified for centuries as barbaric raiders, were suddenly being reconsidered, were being celebrated as symbols of Nordic strength and courage, as ancestors to be proud of rather than ashamed of. And in this context, Lagertha was rediscovered, was held up as an example of Viking valor, as proof that Nordic women had been strong and capable, as a figure who could inspire national pride. This 19th century Lagertha was often sanitized, her darker elements downplayed or ignored, her murder of her husband either not mentioned or explained away. She became a purely heroic figure, a warrior woman who proved that Nordic peoples had always valued female strength, that the Viking Age had been a kind of golden age when women enjoyed freedoms they would later lose. This was, of course, a distortion, a simplification that served contemporary needs rather than accurately representing the past. The Viking Age had not been particularly egalitarian, had not been a feminist paradise. Women had occupied subordinate positions in most aspects of life, had been subject to male authority, had been valued primarily for their roles as wives and mothers. Lagertha was exceptional precisely because she was an exception, because she transcended the normal limitations rather than operating within a culture that fully accepted female warriors. But the 19th century interpretation, for all its inaccuracies, did serve to keep Lagertha's legend alive, to introduce her story to new audiences, to ensure that she would not be forgotten. And it laid the groundwork for later interpretations, for the ways that 20th and 21st century scholars and popular culture would engage with her story. The 20th century brought new perspectives, new ways of understanding Lagertha's legend. Archaeologists began finding evidence that complicated the traditional picture of Viking Age gender roles, discovering graves of women buried with weapons, finding material culture that suggested women's roles had been more diverse than previously thought. While this evidence did not prove that Shieldmaidens like Lagertha had been common, it did suggest that the possibility of female warriors was not as far-fetched as skeptics had claimed. Historians began to study women's history more systematically, to ask questions about women's lives and experiences that previous generations had largely ignored. And in this context, Lagertha became a subject of serious scholarly attention, with debates about whether she had really existed, what aspects of her legend might be historical, what she could tell us about women's possibilities in the Viking Age. And popular culture embraced her with unprecedented enthusiasm. Lagertha appeared in novels and comic books, in television series and video games, in artwork and music. Most famously, she became a central character in the History Channel's Vikings series, where she was portrayed as a fierce warrior, a complex character who was both heroic and flawed, both strong and vulnerable. This modern Lagertha, as portrayed in popular culture, often bears limited resemblance to the figure in Saxo's chronicle. She is adapted, modified, made to speak to contemporary concerns about gender equality, about women's empowerment, about the representation of strong female characters in media. Her story is expanded, given dimensions and details that Saxo never mentioned, connected to other characters and plot lines in ways that serve dramatic purposes rather than historical accuracy. Is this a problem? Should we object to these adaptations? Insist that Lagertha be portrayed only as Saxo described her? That modern interpretations stay faithful to the medieval sources? Perhaps not. For legends have always been adapted, have always been shaped to serve the needs of each generation that tells them. The Lagertha of Saxo's chronicle was already an adaptation, already a medieval Christian scholar's interpretation of what may have been earlier oral traditions. There is no pure, original version to which we can return, no definitive account that all others are distorting. Instead, there is a legend that has evolved across a millennium, that has been told and retold, that has served different purposes in different times, that has been made to speak to each generation's concerns and values. And this adaptability, this capacity to remain relevant across vast changes in culture and society, this is perhaps the true measure of a legend's power. Lagertha means something different to us than she meant to Saxo, meant something different to Saxo than she meant to the Vikings who first told stories about her, if indeed they did. But the core remains: a woman warrior, someone exceptional who defied expectations, someone whose courage and capability could not be denied, someone who claimed space in a world that said women had no right to claim it. This core idea, this fundamental challenge to gender limitations, this is what makes Lagertha enduring, what ensures that her legend continues to evolve and inspire. Each generation discovers her anew, finds in her story something that speaks to their own struggles, their own aspirations, their own fights against limitations and prejudices. For women today, who face barriers to advancement, who are told they cannot do certain things because of their gender, who must constantly prove themselves in ways that men do not, Lagertha offers both inspiration and caution. Inspiration because she shows that such barriers can be overcome, that determination and skill can force a place even in the most resistant contexts. Caution because she also shows the cost of being exceptional, the loneliness of being the only one, the ways that proving yourself can harden you, can require sacrifices that perhaps should not have to be made. For historians and archaeologists, Lagertha raises important questions about women's roles in the Viking Age, about how much diversity existed within gender norms, about the dangers of assuming that written sources tell the whole story. Even if Lagertha herself is legendary, the fact that Vikings could conceive of female warriors, could tell stories about them, could preserve such legends. This tells us something valuable about their culture, about the spaces where women could exercise agency and power. And for all of us, regardless of gender, Lagertha offers a reminder that the past was not monolithic, that people in earlier times were as diverse and complex as people today, that history contains multitudes of experiences and possibilities, that our ancestors were capable of surprising us, of being more than we imagined they could be. The legend of Lagertha has traveled far from its origins, has been transformed by time and retelling, has become something larger and more symbolic than any one historical person could be. The woman who may have lived in 9th century Norway, who may have fought beside Ragnar, who may have ruled a jarldom, this woman is lost to us, separated by time and scarcity of sources, knowable only in glimpses and fragments. But the legend, the idea, the symbol of Lagertha, the Shieldmaiden, this is very much alive, is perhaps more vital now than at any time since the Viking Age. She appears in more stories, reaches more people, inspires more discussions about gender and power and possibility than she ever did in her own time or in the centuries immediately following. This is the paradox of legends. The person becomes less real even as the idea becomes more powerful. The historical Lagertha, if she existed, has been obscured by the legendary Lagertha, has become almost irrelevant to what her story now means. We cannot recover the truth of her life, cannot separate fact from fiction in Saxo's account, cannot know with any certainty what she actually did or who she really was. But we can honor the legend, can recognize its value, can appreciate what it has meant across the centuries to those who heard it, who were inspired by it, who found in it permission to imagine themselves differently, to claim possibilities they had been told were impossible. Lagertha, the Shieldmaiden, whether historical figure or legendary ideal, whether one woman or a composite of many, whether literal truth or poetic compression, has earned her immortality. She has become a permanent part of how we understand the Viking Age, how we think about women's history, how we imagine the relationship between gender and capability. Her saga has been told. Her legend will continue. And as long as there are people who face limitations, who are told they cannot do something because of who they are, who must fight for recognition and respect in worlds not built for them, the story of Lagertha will matter, will inspire, will remind them that barriers can be broken, that the impossible can become possible, that courage and determination can change the world. And so, we come to the end of our journey with Lagertha, to the quiet close of a tale that began in violence and ended in ambiguity, that inspired and troubled in equal measure, that challenged our understanding of what was possible in the Viking Age and what legends mean across the centuries. We have followed her from her first appearance in the sources, from that moment when she took up arms and became a warrior, through her marriage to Ragnar and her divorce from him, through her establishment as an independent Jarl and her choice to aid her former husband, to the dark end when she murdered her final husband and faded from the historical record. We have seen her as warrior and ruler, as lover and leader, as hero, and as something darker, more troubling. And we have seen how her legend evolved, how it was preserved by Saxo and rediscovered by later generations, how it was adapted and transformed, how it speaks differently to each age that encounters it, how it remains relevant across a millennium, because the questions it raises, the possibilities it suggests, are eternal rather than merely historical. What can we conclude about Lagertha? What can we say with confidence after walking through her story, after acknowledging all the uncertainties and ambiguities, after trying to see her both as she may have been and as legend has made her? We can say that she represents possibility, the breaking of barriers, the refusal to accept limitations. Whether she was one woman or many, whether the stories are literal or symbolic, whether she existed exactly as described or represents something larger, she stands for the idea that courage and capability are not bound by gender, that women can be warriors, rulers, makers of their own destinies. We can also say that she represents the complexity of power, the ways that achieving greatness often requires compromises, sometimes requires ruthlessness, that the same strength that allows one to overcome barriers can also lead to darkness, that exceptional people are capable of both exceptional virtue and exceptional vice. And we can say that she matters, that her legend has value, that the very fact that her story has been preserved and retold for more than 1,000 years speaks to something deep in human nature, some need for tales that challenge our assumptions, that show us what is possible, that remind us that the world has always been more diverse and complicated than did we imagine. The historical questions about Lagertha will probably never be fully resolved. Did she really exist? If so, how much of Saxo's account is accurate? Were there really Shieldmaidens, women who fought as warriors in significant numbers, or was Lagertha a unique exception, or even a complete invention? Archaeologists and historians will continue to debate these questions, will examine the evidence, will propose theories and counter-theories. But in some ways, these questions matter less than the legend itself, less than what Lagertha has come to represent. For she has transcended her historical origins, has become a symbol that exists independent of whatever truth may lie behind the sources. And symbols, ideas, legends, these have their own kind of reality, their own power to shape how we think and what we believe is possible. For women throughout history who have faced barriers because of their gender, who have been told they cannot do something simply because they are women, Lagertha has offered proof that such barriers are not absolute, that they can be challenged and broken. She has been an inspiration, a role model, a reminder that exceptional women have always existed, have always found ways to transcend limitations, have always refused to accept what society said was impossible. And for all people, regardless of gender, Lagertha represents the human capacity for courage, for determination, for the refusal to be bound by circumstances or convention. She reminds us that we are not limited to the roles assigned to us by birth or society. that we can choose to be more, to do more, to become something unexpected and extraordinary. These are not small things. These are the functions that legends serve, the reasons they endure across centuries, the value they provide to each generation that encounters them. And by this measure, Lagertha has earned her place among the great legends of the Viking Age, has proven herself worthy of remembrance, has ensured that her name will echo across time as long as humans tell stories about courage and possibility. In the quiet north, where winters are still long and the memory of the Vikings remains part of the cultural landscape, Lagertha's name is still spoken. Not as often as Ragnar's, perhaps not with the same immediate recognition. But among those who know the deeper stories, who understand the complexity of the Viking Age, who appreciate the diversity that existed within that culture, Lagertha is remembered and honored. And beyond the north, in places the Vikings never reached, in cultures that have no direct connection to Scandinavian history, Lagertha's legend has found new life, new audiences, new meanings. She has become, in our global age, a symbol that transcends her origins, that speaks to universal human experiences and aspirations, that reminds us that the past holds lessons for the present, that history is not dead, but continues to shape how we understand ourselves and our possibilities. The saga of Lagertha is ending, but the legend will continue, will evolve, will be retold in ways we cannot now imagine, will serve purposes we cannot now foresee. Each generation will discover her anew, will find in her story something that speaks to their own concerns, their own struggles, their own dreams of what might be possible. And perhaps, centuries from now, people will still tell stories of the Shieldmaiden who fought alongside men, who married a legend and then left him to forge her own path, who proved that women could be warriors and rulers, who lived a life of extraordinary courage and troubling complexity. Perhaps they will continue to debate what is historical and what is legendary, what can be known and what must remain mysterious. Perhaps they will continue to find in her story inspiration and challenge, hope and caution, a reminder of what humans can achieve and what costs such achievement may demand. For this is the power of legend, the reason we tell and retell these stories, the value they provide across the vast gulf of time. They connect us to our past, remind us that people who lived centuries or millennia ago were still people, were still capable of extraordinary things, were still struggling with many of the same questions we struggle with today. They challenge our assumptions, force us to confront the diversity and complexity of history, remind us that the past was not simpler or more straightforward than the present, that humans have always been capable of surprising us, of being more than we expected. And they inspire us, give us models and examples, show us what is possible when courage meets opportunity, when determination refuses to accept limitations, when someone decides that they will write their own story rather than accepting the story others have written for them. Welcome to the Sleepy Historian. We have drifted across the centuries together, have walked with a Shieldmaiden through triumph and tragedy, have witnessed how a woman became a legend, and how that legend has echoed across a millennium. May you rest well, carrying with you something of Lagertha's courage, her determination to live life on her own terms, her refusal to be limited by others' expectations. Sleep now. The saga is told. The legend endures. And somewhere in the space between history and myth, between fact and story, Lagertha the Shieldmaiden remains eternal and inspiring, a reminder that the past was full of extraordinary people, that women have always been capable of greatness, that legends are made by those brave enough to step beyond what is expected and claim what seems impossible. May her memory inspire your dreams. May her courage remind you of what is possible. May her legend, with all its light and shadow, with all its certainty and ambiguity, carry you gently through the night into sleep and into dreams of ancient times when warriors walked the earth and women could be heroes, when the North sent forth legends that would echo forever, when a shield maiden proved that courage knows no gender and that greatness comes in many forms. Good night.